Welcome to the Doctors Building Wealth podcast. Today, Kenji and I are going to be talking about turning knowledge into action. Why knowing isn't enough. And this is something that we thought was relevant to all of you because it's so relevant to us. And I can't tell you how many times we've fallen into this issue and fallen into this trap of thinking that we know something and we already got it down and kind of blocking out all the other information coming in. So we wanted to bring it up with you guys because we think it's really applicable. And we have some really great pointers on how to move through this, some applicable pointers on how to move through this so you don't continue to do it in your life, because I think it's harmful to a lot of us.
Yeah, and this one came up very recently. We were at a seminar, and this was probably I don't know, our 10th seminar, the same exact seminar. And people would come up and say, like, why do you keep coming back? And there are a lot of reasons why we keep coming back to the same seminar with the same content. But part of it is because we want to overcome this. Oh, I know this. I've heard this before, and we'll talk about why it's so important and what do we get out of these, like going the 10th time, right? Why are we doing that? And we'll get into that. But again, I just wanted to kind of share that example because that is really what prompted this episode.
Yeah. So what's the problem here? So when you start to say, I know this. So let's say that you're attending a lecture, let's say in med school, and you already feel like you know it, or let's say you're attending a real estate
Why don't we say zero to freedom?
yeah, let's say you're attending our course and you're hearing about something, and maybe you're already an investor, maybe you own a couple of properties, and you look at it and you start listening and you're like, oh, I know this. So what's the downside of that? Well, number one is when you dismiss information because you feel like you've already seen it, you lose the opportunity to have any other meanings that are in that information. So for example, when all of us hear things the first time, we oftentimes hear only like 10% or 20% of it that we retain long term. And so even if we're hearing exactly the same two sentences again, what you will often find if you don't dismiss it, if you continue to have an open mind, is there were other pieces of that information in there that you missed the first time because you heard one piece, but you didn't hear all the little pieces in there.
Yeah, and I think another really important aspect of this is what else could you learn from it? And I think about our course, and we do have experienced people taking our Zero to Freedom course, and they'll come in, they have multiple properties, and there's a subset of people who are like, oh, I know all this, I've heard this, right? And they just dismiss it. But there is another subset who are like asking themselves, well, what can I learn from this, right? And it's those people that we see kind of take their properties and go and improve them significantly because there are things that they missed the first time, right? Or there are things that they didn't know, even though they thought they knew it all.
And, why does this happen? Why are we only retaining part of what, is being said to us? Well, it's a mental shortcut, right? Because there's so much information that we're getting all the time. We really have to kind of boil it down and just remember what we think is important to us. And so it's really natural that you're only going to hear the piece of what is being said to you. And I have to say the piece that's relevant to you, right? Because what you're going to tend to remember is what you say, oh yeah, I needed to know that, or aha, oh, that makes sense. And that's the piece you're going to tend to focus on and remember. And you're going to miss out on all those other pieces of information that next time you see it may actually be information that is now relevant to you. So you're going to catch that the second or third or fourth or 10th time around like we do.
Yeah, and I see this a lot especially when we cover mindset topics. People will say, "Oh, like gratitude is a really important concept, right?" And it's something that I really turn to if I'm ever, anxious or fearful. And I go to gratitude because there's so many things to be grateful for, but it's also so easy to dismiss them or to just not see them, or to only see the bad things, right? To see the problems as opposed to seeing all the gifts. And so gratitude is something that people will say like, oh yeah, I know about gratitude, and I also use gratitude. But the real question is, do they really apply gratitude on a consistent basis? There's a real difference between knowing about it and actually implementing it on a daily basis.
Yeah. So what we just covered is a lot of times, you only hear part of something the first time. And so it takes multiple times to get through it. But the second part is what Kenji was just talking about. You heard it, but did you apply it, right? Are you actually living that way? Because a lot of times we will attend a conference, for example, get, 50 billion pieces of information. and say, okay, I know it all. And yeah, you know it in terms of you've heard it, but are you actually living that way? Have you applied it in your life? Is it actually part of who you are now? Or do you just know it in your mind, but you're not actually practicing it?
Yeah, and I see actually more like there's a couple different levels in there where it's like, oh, I know it, and then I've used it, right? Or I've done it. And that makes people feel like, okay, yeah, I am incorporating this into my life. But then there's a whole nother level, which is like, did you achieve mastery or is it a habit, right? It is something that's just automatic. You do it because you have really not just learned it, but you have incorporated it. It's in your body. You've conditioned it. And that's a whole nother level that I wanted to kind of make a distinction between the people who, yeah, oh, I've done it. I practiced that before versus the people who are on an ongoing basis, on a minute by minute basis, who are living it. It's in their body. It's conditioned. It's a habit.
Yeah, I mean, and a good example of this is, hey, I've heard before I should exercise, right? I should exercise 30 minutes 5 days a week, right? And then there's like, oh yeah, I used to do that. Or I work out like, once in a while versus I actually do this every single week. It is part of who I am. It's my identity. And I'm going to show up and I'm going to make it happen no matter what's going on. It's a very different level of application in your life. And so I think a lot of times people you be getting some information and you'll say, "Oh, I know that." But the question is, do you know it intellectually, and have you actually applied it, and are you consistently applying it in your life? That's a different level of knowledge. So the next pitfall we oftentimes see people fall into is when they go into the I know mind, they kind of turn things off. What they miss is there's actually a deeper meaning that they missed the first time of the original content that they remember. And now they have additional context or they have additional experience. And now they can capture that deeper meaning that was in that same information. And that's a different experience. And then sometimes it takes that growth to be able to hear that same thing and get more out of it.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier. Like, why do we keep going to the same conference all the time? Is that we are actually different people when we go the second time versus the fifth time versus the 10th time. And so, in that context, if we hear something again, being a different person, being somebody who has greater insights, for example, then we hear it differently, right? Or we think about how we can apply it differently. I think it actually also, in the real estate context, you tap into this another level of creativity, and that kind of makes sense, right? Is because if you hear something for the first time, your brain is just processing what it means the first time. You're not actually being creative and tapping into all these different other areas of your life where you can draw from them and apply them to real estate, right? Because you're not you're beyond that like just learning stage. You know it, it's in your body, you've conditioned it, and then you're like, okay, you hear it again because you're already at that stage, and then you can get creative with it, right?
Yeah, you could be totally shocked by how many little nuances there are in each, sentence of information that you miss because you don't have the context to fully understand it. And then you go back a year or two later and you're like, "Oh my god, he said that the whole time and I totally missed it the first time because I didn't understand. I didn't have the knowledge or experience or context to really understand what the person was saying. And I got the shallow meaning out of it, but I did not really capture it."
Yeah, and I'll give you a real estate example, and this is a topic that we'll talk about in a future episode. But it's about patterns, and there's different levels of patterns, and we apply these patterns to finding hidden value, right? These are opportunities to increase the value of a property, and just knowing about hidden value is kind of one level. But the people who really excel, the people who really create real value and create increase the value of their property significantly, and they actually increase their net worth significantly, are the people who take that hidden value concept and apply it and kind of create new patterns, right? And they're able to do that because they've seen so many old patterns. I'm not going to say old patterns, but I'm going to say patterns that already exist, and they're able to kind of think beyond, because they know this so well. They've trained themselves, and so when it comes to, they're looking at a property, they come up with these new patterns, new ideas, and that creativity again is the next level beyond just knowing, right? And it's knowing, getting into your body, making it a habit, and then I think that creativity comes after that. So there's so many different levels here, and I think that this is so important to kind of get past this I know mind, and just say that there are so many different levels that you can tap into, and when you do tap into that, you will get to this another level of creativity. And again, that's what we're starting to see by going to the same seminar for the 10th time.
Right. The next one is one I've fallen into so many times, which is ego and the comfort zone. When you get into the I know mind, you kind of shut everything off, right? You're like, oh, I know, and you can tend to cut people off actually. And I have done this a lot in the past because I'm so eager to say, well, we've already done that. Like, let's move on. But what that does is that potentially means that I missed something that was a deeper insight that they were having in that explanation to me or in teaching me that concept, because I rushed things and because I thought I already had it, but I probably didn't. And it was all comes down to ego, and it comes down to assumptions that you know it, you've mastered it. Let's move on to the other stuff. Sometimes it's really, really helpful to listen to things again, listen to them very deeply, and you might find that there's so much more to it that you didn't get in the first time around, but you're protecting yourself because you're protecting your ego because you already think you know it.
Yeah, I think that it's important, and it's an important lesson for me. It's always a good reminder. All these episodes are a good reminder for what I can do better, and yeah, approaching those situations with a level of humbleness, right? And not just saying, oh, I know this already, or like, why do you keep repeating the same thing? Like, we already know this. Like, let's move on, right? And not digging a little bit deeper, not asking those better questions, and really, I think a lot of that creation, that creativity we're just talking about, comes from being humble and continue to ask those questions and not just dismissing it.
Yeah. And Leslie, I just want to say that they're so helpful to hear the same thing. Like, let's just say the person saying exactly the same thing you already heard before, and there's nothing new and there's nothing deeper, and you actually got it 100% before. There's so much good that comes out of hearing the same thing over and over again, because when you need it, it will pop into your mind. If you heard things once, what are the odds that you're going to be able to recall it exactly when you need in, rapidity, with rapidity? But if you've heard it 15 times, it will literally come through you. And you will be sitting there and somebody will say something and you'll think of it and you'll be able to say the words, because you've heard it 20 different times. So that the tracks in your brain are laid down so deeply, those grooves in your brain, that when you need that information, you will pull it out at a different level with a different speed, and it will be so applicable. And so that's part of that living the knowledge, is that you hear it so many times that you actually integrate it so deeply into yourself that it does come out of you all the time when you actually need it, instead of just being something hidden that you remember vaguely in the past.
Yeah. So the question is like, how do you overcome the I know mindset? And we have a few tips for you that we use for ourselves. And I think the first one is adopting a beginner's mindset. And so just approaching every piece of new information as if it's new, and asking yourself, what can I learn from this? And that was that example we were sharing earlier about people who are more experienced investors taking zero to freedom. I think that that's a really important question to ask, is what can I learn from this? Because when you do ask that question, then you will draw out insights. And we've seen this. We've seen people draw out insights and figure out ways to improve their properties beyond what they did themselves because they missed it the first time or they didn't know about it. And if they didn't, approach it with a beginner's mindset, they would have completely missed it. They would have dismissed it. They would have been like, okay, this course, didn't help me.
Yeah. And so the next one is, if you are starting to say, I know that, ask yourself if you're really practicing it, right? Is this something you've integrated into your life, or you just know it because you've heard it once and it's somewhere in the back of your brain? And so that really will allow you to keep yourself humble. And that will allow you to say, hey, maybe I need to hear this again because maybe this is important enough. I actually want to live it. And I'm not doing that right now. And then you can kind of re-engage, stop that I know mindset and get back into the information and start learning again. And then lastly, through this whole experience of how to overcome the I know mind, we'd really suggest staying humble, and thinking that there might actually be something you don't know, right? That the person is going to share with you, or something that you missed the first time that's actually there. That's a deeper meaning that you missed because you didn't have the context, you didn't have experience to be able to truly grasp that, or because you just only remember 10% of what people tell you the first time around. And so all those things should help you be able to stay present, because that's really what it's about. Is a lot of us will zone out and we'll be like, oh, I know this, and we'll go on to something else. But stay present in the moment and be able to learn from something, even if you're hearing it, for the 10th time. Now, what are some things that we have practiced over time that have helped us to be able to have our minds act this way, to be able to stay humble, to be able to stay present, to be able to say, hey, I need this for the 15th time because it's going to dig those deeper grooves in, and it's going to come up, at a different level, and I'm going to start living it, right? What are some of those things that are most useful to us? Well, number one is mindset work. Kench and I do a ton of mindset work. We're constantly putting ourselves in situations every single month, actually, where we're learning, we're growing, we're becoming different human beings because we're training our brains to think differently. And so we would really encourage all of you who haven't invested on any money on your mind and your growth to come to conferences, to take courses, to read books. I mean, so many phenomenal books out there, and to do the work that allows you to be able to grow, so that these types of experiences of saying I know and just shutting yourself down don't happen as much.
Yeah, but I think it's like taking that whatever you learn from a book or a conference or from somebody else, maybe a course, but then really incorporating that, right? Really practicing that. And so, from a mindset perspective, just today, I was sending a message to one of our groups about the importance of making decisions, right? And I think for Leite and I, we think that this is something that has been really one of the keys to our success is the ability to make decisions and not to get stuck with certain decisions, and also not to regret a decision that we've made. Those are both really important. And in order to get to that point, it does require practice. It does require making it a habit that decisions are something that you just do, right? Or maybe it's an identity where you're like, I'm the type of person who makes decisions, right? I'm decisive, right? Because I can tell you right now, I've spoken to so many people who label themselves as I'm an indecisive person, right? And that's just a choice. If you can actually choose to label yourself completely different and claim the identity, I am a decisive person. And to get to that point, not to make sure that it's not just words, right? You have to back it up, right? You have to back it up with actual practice where you are, even with the small things to the big things, you're making decisions, right? And then that's what makes you a decisive person when you actually execute on it.
And then the last one I think really is putting yourself in a situation where you're around people who think this way. Being in a community where people are working on their mindsets, where they are learning, constantly learning things, but also they're showing up and not walking around with this I know mind. They're eager, they're curious, they're present, they're asking questions, they're thinking that maybe they missed something the first time, and they're being humble about what they know, but are have this thirst for growth, some hunger for growth. Those are the people you want to be around, because these are people that continually expand themselves and what's possible for them. And you, because of association, will be able to do that too.
Now, I wanted to give you another practical application for real estate investing. We've been talking about mindset, but let's talk about real estate investing. And what are some practical applications that would take you from this I know mind to achieving mastery? And I think about our course, right? And so, if you've taken Zero to Freedom, I remember just recently somebody was telling us that they went through the whole course again, and I thought,
Right. They do. And a lot of people do the reboot, which is just going through the entire course again for 7 weeks.
yeah, and I was so impressed because that's actually not the typical, right? The typical is, oh, I've gone through it, I know it, right? And very few people really, and that's why this was so remarkable, right? Very few people actually go through the entire course again and again, right? And so, and there are some exceptions. There are people who've gone through, like you said, the reboot a third and a fourth time, and you might think, oh, they didn't get it the first time. No, that's not it at all. They're wanting to achieve mastery, right? They're really wanting to learn the concepts. They're curious. They're like, what did I miss the first time? What can I learn, right? And so this is again just a simple example here, or simple practical application of this, but it is something that I think could be very, very useful and could lead to some of those creative ideas we talked about earlier, where, if you go through it the second or third time, you might come up with some ideas that you can then go in and use to create value.
Yeah, so hopefully you got a lot out of this episode of really thinking about the I know mind, reflecting on how often you fall into it, and also getting some tools for how to avoid falling into it and what you could do alternatively instead to avoid missing out on all those opportunities that come when you use that I know mind and you kind of block them. If you enjoyed this episode of Doctors Building Wealth podcast, make sure to subscribe, share it with a friend, and we'll see you the next episode.